good food, good hydration, good sleep. You have that, you're recovered. This is all what we are doing is because the things that we need to do, we don't do.
Yeah.
So we're trying to optimize that 1% and let me get this and let me get that. And honestly, if you sleep well and you eat well, you're fine. The problem is most of us don't do that.
Use of steroids has actually ruined Indian sports scene.
So yeah, I mean, I think the state of affairs is bad, and that's why you need a Neeraj Chopra, right? To show you that there is a way out, to show you that you can actually achieve fame, success, money, everything with sports. And it's not just Neeraj Chopra. I mean, a lot of the Indian athletes.
You speak with one company for one thing and you're going to get 20 calls for the same thing.
My car insurance was expiring and I got like 10 messages from 10 people and how do you have my data? It's all because of data brokers.
Can you help us change that? What are some of the things that worry you about the laws that govern our daily lives?
I mean, honestly, it's not the laws, it's the enforcement. I think that worries me. Everything I am in terms of running is because of LRR and the people there. I've learned everything.
But how are you guys all so fast?
It's a fast group. That is a fact. It's a really fast group.
Tell me about the mental toughness side of it. So what do you do in the moments that you feel like giving up?
That's what I think about running. Like, it's the sports is the biggest teacher in life, right? You learn failure because you will fail. You cannot succeed all the time. You know, sometimes I think the best results are achieved when you don't expect them.
How do you deal with failure? So when you were aiming for something and it didn't happen, how long do you let that affect you?
You know what's right. You try and aspire to do what's right, but you don't always achieve that.
Tell me about the challenges of being a female athlete. Talk us through your journey of becoming better every year. What are sort of the main principles that you follow? Tell us about all of these that you've learned over the last couple of years. Strength training. What does your strength routine look like?
I mean,
welcome back to the Find Your Ultra podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Vrinda Bhandari. She's a powerhouse who wears two different hats with equal brilliance. Vrinda is a lawyer and she's known for her sharp mind and a relentless commitment to justice. She's also been a part of many high-profile cases in the country. But outside the courtroom, she's an incredibly fast runner who brings the same discipline, focus and drive of her legal career to the running track. In this episode, we discuss how she balances the intensity of her career and the demands of training. If you're somebody who's looking to get really fast, this is an episode for you to listen to. And also, if you're someone whose career is very demanding, this is an episode for you too. We've spoken about law a little bit, her career, the way she balances things and manages things, and what drives her. We've tapped a little bit into motivation, what really keeps her going, and touched a little bit upon her comeback post-pregnancy. And we also talk about the impact that her community, Lutyens Roadrunners, has had in her running journey. And to sum up the introduction, this is a road scholar, a top lawyer, a top runner, a top performer in every field. Thank you, Nakul Bhutta, for the recommendation. And so without further ado, here's Vrinda Bhandari and me in the Find Your Ultra podcast. Indulge away. Vrinda Bhandari, welcome to the Find Your Ultra podcast.
thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you for making time and agreeing to do this. We've been trying to schedule this for a while. Yes.
I think like a couple of months or more.
More actually. I think, early this year I got in touch.
Yes. After NDM.
Yes.
I think after NDM.
I don't know where to start. Tell me about these books first of all. Don't tell me you've read all of them.
No, not all of them. Like any good lawyer, I have lots of books.
Yeah, it's
but
insane.
only need them some of the time.
Yeah.
Not all of the time, no.
But that's fabulous. Like, you're a reader for sure, right?
Yes.
You are?
I mean, I don't read as much now, fiction, because I think just every day for work, you're reading so much. So it becomes a bit hard to read for pleasure. So I now listen to a lot of podcasts. So reading is now for holidays. So in the summer holidays, I read a couple of books finally. And I was like, good to get the reading going again.
But is it like a sort of mandate for a lawyer to read a lot?
Oh, yes.
You have to, right?
You can't not read because you have to read your files for the matters. You have to do research. So, you read the research, the case law.
Yeah.
I mean, reading is, most of the job.
Great. So on this podcast, we get to know the person first. So do take us back to your childhood. Talk us through your journey a little bit. How did you choose law? So we'll get to that, but just talk us through your childhood.
Yeah. So, I grew up in Delhi. I have an elder brother and, I went to DPS Arkipuram. And although everybody obviously has the impression of DPS being like a really academic school, my sports journey actually started at DPS. So I used to play basketball and I was in the basketball team, and then I played the nationals thanks to my basketball coach.
Nationals?
So yes.
Wow.
So I played nationals, I think, from class 8 onwards. So 8th to 12th, I went for sub-junior nationals, junior, and then under 18, the under 18 nationals. So I played a lot of basketball throughout school. I did a bit of running. So for 2 years, I tried to run like 800s. And so I used to go to the stadium to train twice or thrice a week.
Nehru Stadium.
Mm-hmm. But then at some point, I just realized it's too hard to do studies and basketball and athletics all together. So I kind of gave up on athletics and focused on basketball. And I always wanted to do eco honors, and I wanted to go to Stevens. And as my friend in class 12, told me, what if you don't get 95% and you don't want to do sports quota? What's your backup option? And I suddenly got really stressed that I have no backup options. So I sort of just decided, okay, let me write the law school entrance exams. And so that sort of is how I started on my journey to law.
What did your parents do?
So my dad's an IITian. My brother's also an IITian. And so, everybody in my family had kind of gone to IIT. And so when I was in 11th, I told my parents, and I also had science. And I said, I'm not cut out for IIT. I know Pradeep's for physics, but you give me an HC Verma and I cannot understand it. So everybody in my family had an engineering background, or the extended families, CAs. So there was no lawyer in the family.
Yeah.
My mom is a housewife, but she's actually my biggest inspiration in terms of sports. So she herself is a very sporty player. She used to, run and swim. And even today she, swims. She runs, like, she's 66 and she'll still do like 3.5 kilometers. These, those mini races.
Really?
So for this, my daughter's 15th August school celebrations, they have this Azadi Ki Daur. So my mom, my daughter and me did the 3.2K runs. So she's really my inspiration behind all the sports that I played. Like, I played every sport growing up, like every sport. And my parents were always very encouraging. So they were not your traditional parents, Indian parents, in terms of just study.
Right.
I think they really valued sports. I also myself am fairly academically driven. So, I mean, that there is that. Like, they didn't have to, force me and say, oh, pado. I used to study on my own. But I think they really gave me the love for sports really comes from my mom. And it's not just playing, like, it's watching. So, and it's not just watching cricket, like every Indian family watches cricket, but it's actually watching like Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, Asian
That's
Games.
rare.
Yeah, that's rare. And that really comes from my mom. Like, even
That's
today.
amazing. How did she get into sports? Like, did she have these aspirations?
No. She grew up in Cal. I mean, just my Nana himself, like, used to support United. So, I mean, even growing up, kind of, I used to watch the United matches. He himself loves sports. So I think it was just, she was exposed to it. Cal was much more liberal. I'm from Rajasthan, as in my family is from Jodhpur.
Okay.
So, Jodhpur is much more conservative. But I think, my mom was just exposed to a lot of sports, games. She used to play tennis, swimming, everything. Like, my Nana used to play tennis. So I think it was just a sporting family, which is rare.
Right.
I think for traditional Indian families.
When you were making the decision to, let's say, go for law, did you have an idea of what this professional, what life like a lawyer looks like?
Oh my God, like none. Like, literally, when I say nobody in my family is a lawyer, like nobody in my extended family is a lawyer. Everybody joins law school tuitions in June, right? Like, you start the new year and you start the tuitions. And I joined in October because I was like, oh my God, like, what if I don't get, like I said, my only goal was Stevens. And I was clear I didn't want to do sports quota. And so then Stevens Eco really, it's a high bar. So you have to get 95. And I was like, what if I don't? I have to have some backup. And so I really went in with zero idea. NUJS, which is a really great law school in Calcutta, I hadn't even heard of it. I just had heard of NLS Bangalore. So really, I think I went in with complete, like, eyes to.
So Bangalore is where you studied law?
I studied, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. And you mentioned you were active throughout the school days.
Yes.
And you dabbled into athletics as well.
Yeah.
Talk us through that phase. Were there any coaches who encouraged you, or was it?
Oh, yes, 100%. I mean, I think my school basketball coach, I was one of the few people who didn't really take professional basketball coaching, like at that level in terms of playing nationals. But my basketball coach was very encouraging. She introduced me. And honestly, I also think my parents were great. I mean, we used to go. I was 14. My first nationals was in Pondicherry. You go by train. It's a two-night journey. You're 14 years old. You go with like 14 boys, 14 girls with an unknown coach. These are not the days of cell phones. So you used to stand in the PCO booth to make a call home and say on the STD booth and say, oh, today was fine. This is what happened. You speak to your parents once a day. And in today's sort of overprotective, like hyperactive parenting, this is unthinkable. But I think my basketball coach was very influential. And then I had this athletics coach his name was Rai Sir. He used to also coach at the stadium. So he was really great in terms of just encouraging my love for athletics. And I think it's not actually just the sports teachers, but my school teachers were great because they really also, like my chemistry teacher, Mrs. Dhami, would actually stay back after school and help me out with chemistry, in 11th and 12th, if I had to miss school for some IPSC tournaments so apart from the nationals, DPS was also part of the IPSC, which is like a boarding school. I mean, it's a sports competition amongst most of the boarding schools in India.
Okay.
So every year we also went to like Mayo and Vellums and, all these places to play basketball tournaments. And so I missed school often. And so she would stay back and just help me. And I think, so even from the teachers, I got a lot of support to make sure that academically I never suffered. Because I think at the end of the day, I was very clear that academics was my first priority. So in class 12, when I was at the nationals, I actually got shortlisted for India camp. And that's the first time my parents ever said no. They said, listen, we have never said anything to you. But, July, you're going to have your exams. And I also knew I wasn't good enough to actually make it to the India team. I mean, I was good enough to get shortlisted, but I would not have made it for the India team. And my parents said no. And oh my God, I had a fit and I, cried and bawled my heart out. And I said, how can you say no? But I think that was the one time they said, look, you do have your exams, and if you want to study, you kind of really do have to focus. And that's really the only time they said no in terms of sports. But otherwise, throughout school, throughout college, I mean, I played through college, through postgrad. Yeah. I played at NLS, I played at Oxford. I was captain of the Blues basketball team at Oxford. So, I mean, I think I played basketball throughout.
But it's sad in a way. Why didn't you choose sports as a career then? Because you were good. You're saying maybe not good enough to get into Team India, but you were good.
Definitely not good enough to get into. I mean, I have to also know my limitations. I was not good enough to get into Team India. And look, I mean, the sad reality is it is not a viable career.
Yeah.
It is not. What is the most that you can get? You'll play it a couple of times. There's no job security.
Did you hear that interview of Pulela Gopichand recently?
Yes.
Where he said, don't put your children in sports.
I think it's true. It's hard. I mean, it's very easy to say, yes, we should have more sports players, but look at the facilities. I mean, I've seen the facilities. I've seen the kind of nutrition, the training that happens. There's nothing. I mean, I did not know the N of nutrition when I went to Oxford. And I remember, like, I was having chocolate before some match or something, and somebody looked at me, like one of my teammates, and she had been part of, like, Team GB, like, the Olympics. So I went to Oxford in 2012 to 13. And so this is just post-London 2012, right? So she was like Team GB basketball. And she's like looking at me in shock, being like, what are you eating? Like, how are you eating this? And I really knew nothing about nutrition. And they would give us, we used to go by train. We used to have aloo puri at the stations, right? That is not nutrition. There's no concept of gels and there was no concept of anything. So, I mean, it's tough. So I do a lot of sports-related litigation now. So I still interact with athletes. I do a lot of NADA doping cases as well. So I actually interact with like athletes even today. I mean, it's hard. I think for lots of athletes, it's a way out in terms of job security. Like it's a guaranteed job security. You get a good government job. But to make it to the top is difficult. But I will say it is changing. I think with the top scheme, there's been a lot of investment, with all these private actors like Go Sports Foundation in Bangalore and JSW. Both of them really support a lot of athletes and Paralympians as well. And so there is some change, but the state of sports is...
Yeah.
It's not easy. Like I said, I do a lot of sports litigation for these associations as well. So, you just really see...
Yeah. What's the scene with NADA and WADA? Like, NADA, is it even recognized now?
Yes.
Like, I thought it was de-recognized for a while.
No. There's like, it's very active. Like, there's regular anti-doping cases. Yes. So NADA is very active right now.
And I was recently seeing a video on YouTube somewhere about the state of Indian sports and how the use of steroids has actually ruined Indian sports scene to a large extent. Like, it's so prevalent that people will be shocked. Like, if you go to these stadiums...
Yeah, you see the syringes.
Yeah. And
I mean, it is true. There was that famous video that came out, I think, last year at this athletics meet, right? And, like, it was one of the finals and, like, 8 people just walked off when they realized the NADA officials were there. So, yeah, I mean, I think the state of affairs is bad. And that's why you need a Neeraj Chopra, right? To show you that there is a way out, to show you that you can actually achieve fame, success, money, everything with sports. And it's not just Neeraj Chopra. I mean, a lot of the Indian athletes, and especially in athletics, right? Whether you have Avinash Sable, Tejas Shankar, we do have a bunch of good Parul Chaudhary who are doing really well. So I think it's improving. I think there's still a long way to go. But look at all the badminton players, right? Sindhu, Saina, everybody. And it's even the doubles, Ranki Reddy and Chirag Shetty. So I think it's changing.
Yeah. Doubles, I have a friend, Pranav Jerry Chopra. He's a friend of mine. Have you heard of him?
Vaguely.
Mixed doubles, I think.
Yes.
Mixed doubles player.
Mixed doubles, the only one I know is, I think, Trisa Jolly, this one. And Pullela Gopichand's daughter, Gayatri Gopichand, I think. I think so.
Great, okay. And so how did UK happen?
So I got the Rhodes Scholarship. So in my final year, you can apply for these scholarships. And so the Rhodes it's a scholarship that funds you for minimum 2 up to 3 years or more. So, and they fund everything. So I got the Rhodes Scholarship. So they take 5 students across India in any field. 5
students?
Yes. So
is that that's the number that gets funded in a year?
Yes. So Bill Clinton was famously a Rhodes Scholar. So you'll have a bunch of Montek Singh Ahluwalia is one of the famous Indian Rhodes Scholars. Sagrika Ghosh, Atishi. These were some of the famous Indian Rhodes Scholars. So they fund 5 scholars. So it can be in any field. So in my year, there was 1 lawyer, 1 scientist, 1 environmental engineer, 1 historian. So, the mix changes. So I was the lawyer who was selected in that year. So they fund you for 2 years. So it's to Oxford. It's a scholarship to Oxford only. It's not like the Chevening or the Fulbright, which is to any university in the UK. It is specifically an Oxford scholarship. Cecil Rhodes founded it.
Okay.
And so you get a 2-year scholarship. So I did my master's in law, and then I did a second degree, which was my master's in public policy.
And it is academics, or is it beyond academics?
So you have 5 criteria. You have to excel in academics. So I was second in my class, throughout my batch. So, I think that's a prerequisite, but it's not just an academic scholarship. So you will need leadership skills, sports or extracurricular. So there's 5 qualities. So there's academics, leadership, sports, extracurricular, and moral values. So it's a combined scholarship.
So how does one get tested on moral values?
There's a pretty rigorous process.
Assessment?
Right? No, as in you write. You have to fill up an application form. You have to write an essay, an SOP. They shortlist you. Then you have a law interview, your law sort of shortlist where they'll test you on subject matter competence. Then you have the final interview, which is with, an entire panel. So Ratan Tata was our chairperson. So the chairperson is always somebody very, very preeminent. And so, you'll have a panel and they then can ask you really any questions.
And you also mentioned co-curricular and extracurricular.
Yes.
So running helped you there as well?
Actually, basketball. Because I was playing, I didn't really do much. I'd run 2 half marathons in college, but really it was basketball because I had done all the nationals in school. I had captained the NLS team from, 3rd year onwards. It was more, I would say, basketball than running. I didn't seriously take up running. I ran 3-4 half marathons, but I didn't seriously take up running till actually after I got married and came back and joined a running group. And that sort of changed my life.
We'll talk about that. Tell me about choosing digital rights as a specialization.
So it's one of the things that I do. Digital rights is one. It's the one, if you Google me, that's what comes up more because that's the stuff that gets talked about more. So I've always had an interest in privacy, technology. I also have an academic interest. So I've always written a lot. Apart from litigation, I've written a bunch of academic articles. And so I ended up writing about privacy around the same time as the famous Puttaswamy judgments came. And then I was involved in the Aadhaar case myself, as one of the lawyers. So, I was involved in that entire process. And, nothing kind of gets you into privacy litigation than the Aadhaar case. That was the biggest case in that sense in terms of looking at the intersection between technology, privacy, surveillance rights. I'm also the off counsel for an organization called the Internet Freedom Foundation, which supports digital rights. So for them, we do pro bono work for, people challenging the sedition laws, defamation laws, blocking of websites and accounts, internet shutdowns. We've done challenges to Arogya Setu when Arogya Setu was made mandatory. We challenged
during
that.
COVID,
Yes, during COVID. So we challenged that. Pegasus, the Pegasus surveillance spyware case. So we were involved in that. So that's how all my digital rights work started. So it started in litigation, and because I wrote a lot about it, and then the Data Protection Act was coming for a couple of years. So there was a lot of work that came on that front. So that's one part of my litigation practice. But I also do a lot of criminal law and standard civil law, commercial law. So digital rights is actually just, I guess it's a niche specialization. But then I do a lot of other general.
Yeah, digital rights, I think it has become a mainstream conversation over the last 2-10 years of this government, for sure.
Yes. And also I think with AI, everybody's realizing, privacy has become more than just a buzzword. People are sort of realizing that what does privacy mean? What does technology mean? What does it mean when you have data? Because there's also so much data collection, facial recognition. So we've done a lot of litigation around facial recognition tech, CCTVs, that sort of thing.
That's amazing. Among all of these things that you've been involved with, which ones would you say concern the average? In fact, I'm pretty sure all of these do, right? Which one would stand out to you as something that could be of concern to an average internet user today?
I mean, I think Aadhaar was something that affected everybody.
Yeah.
Whether you liked it or not, a lot of people, obviously many people didn't have objections with Aadhaar. Many people didn't also understand the pros and cons because it was never really discussed.
We never do, right? So when government comes out with a scheme like at tolls, we are going to do this recognition, that recognition, and then but what people don't realize is the amount of surveillance that's also going in, and that's not seen as an invasion of privacy, by an average.
So in fact, the standard argument is, I have nothing to hide. So privacy, I don't care about you can take my data, I have nothing to hide. But everybody has something to hide, right? I mean, you don't walk around in your house with your curtains open. You don't have a shower with your curtains open. Your door is not open, right? Everybody has a private space. And also privacy can be something that, what does privacy mean? It means I am deciding what I want to tell and who I want to tell. So I may tell you some information about my private life, about, who I'm dating or, my sexual orientation. That doesn't mean I've lost my privacy to the world, right? That's only qua you. It doesn't mean that you can disclose that to a third party. And I think the idea that it's only if you have something to hide and if you're a bad person, you have secrets, that's conflating privacy with secrecy. And they're very, very different things. So I think that is just something that people sort of need to understand. So I would say Aadhaar. I would also say, Arogya Setu, the mandatory downloads, it stopped. But there were 2 weeks when they said, you have to mandatorily download Arogya Setu. And part of what we want to do is none of this should be made mandatory. It's not that, we have an opposition to Aadhaar per se and the government should not do it. Our opposition is always about consent. And why should you have a DigiYatra which improves services? Why are you creating a 2-tiered service where if you provide data, you get a faster access? But if you don't provide data, then you get slower access. And so why have we said that instead of having more security personnel or hiring more people so that your lines go faster, why is the answer, let's allow facial recognition tech and allow 5 people to go faster? So I think part of where our objection comes from is making it mandatory or creating a 2-tiered system where you say, and it's also the mindless requirement for Aadhaar. Most people will see it, right? They'll say, you need Aadhaar. And I'm like, but I don't have to give Aadhaar. I can give you my passport. And they're like, no, but but why? It's not mandatory to give Aadhaar everywhere, right? But I think it's the idea that people say, in schools, your kid must get Aadhaar. The Supreme Court is very clear. Children do not need Aadhaar. But again, it's this mindless kind of, everybody needs Aadhaar.
Yeah, and no one questions it.
Yeah, so you have to my kids don't have Aadhaar. And so when, we applied for school admission, they said, you have to give the Aadhaar number. And I said, but actually it's not mandatory. And then I had to, extract parts of the judgment and say, look, this is a government, this is the government's undertaking. This is the Supreme Court order. Nobody's going to do that. Yeah. It's just I'm very concerned about this also. It's an important issue for me.
So my daughter's 3. She's going to be 4 tomorrow, actually, is her birthday.
Oh, well, happy birthday.
Thank you. She has an Aadhaar already. Can you paint a picture for us on, just caricature it for us, on how could all of this be bad for
I'll tell you what, it's not just about surveillance, right? It's also about fraud. Why does fraud happen? All these blue dart frauds. What do they say? Sir, aapka parcel aaya hai, aapka Aadhaar number ye hai. When somebody gives you your Aadhaar number, you inherently believe that person has some data about you that's valid, right? All the scams that work, they work on harvesting of your personal information. It's your address, it's your Aadhaar number, and your Aadhaar number, because we mindlessly give it everywhere, it leaks from everywhere, right? The database in which the Aadhaar, the biometrics are stored may be secure. But the leakage doesn't happen from the centralized database. The leakage happens from all the various nodes that you give it at the hotels, you give it at airports, you give it everywhere, right? And you leave photocopies of your Aadhaar number. And actually UIDAI did introduce kind of tokenization system to hide, parts of your Aadhaar. But nobody really uses that, right? Everybody just gives their Aadhaar card. And when somebody has your number, why are so many phishing scams happening? All these scams, when people are WhatsApping and hacking your accounts, I mean, it is because of, again, just mindless data gathering, right? That's happening, in data brokering, like where any data of yours can be purchased online. And a detailed profile can be made, right? About who you are, what your likes are. Like there's so many studies that say that just from an analysis of your Facebook likes, it's that I think like with 60% or 80% accuracy, they understand your ethnic origin, your nationality, your gender, your sexual orientation, just from an analysis of your likes. I mean, Instagram, right? Again, it targets your kind of targeted browsing. And I think that's why for me, and I know I'm an extreme person in this. Like, I know my views are not held by 95% of the population and, 95% of your audience. And that's fine. It's just, this is my view, right? But like my kids, we have no social media photos of our kids. Like, we do not post any photos of our kids online. We don't show their faces online. We don't give any details. In today's day and age, where again, AI can track your photos, like, we are just very careful as parents to not provide any information about our kids online. And I think this is just, again, like social media use is, I mean, there's so much literature that social media use is bad for kids. And so I think these issues in terms of technology also really interest me.
How old are your kids?
6 and 3.
6 and 3. And how are you managing their phone use?
As in their own phone use? They don't have...
Like, yeah, but do they have any screen time, dedicated screen time and all of that?
Not really. I mean, my elder daughter does obviously now once in a while if she wants to watch TV on a weekend. Like, I don't have an issue. She's 6 now, so she can watch some TV with us. But honestly, they don't watch a lot of
And they don't have access to your phone's YouTube and all of that?
Oh, YouTube, no chance. I mean, I would never show them. YouTube is like just dangerous. Like, I have very strong views on YouTube. And there's so much literature about like YouTube kids also just, sending things that are then not appropriate for children. So YouTube is like, I don't even have the YouTube app. I don't have Instagram. Like, I'm not on Instagram, as you will probably know. Yeah, I'm not on Instagram. So I have strong views on this. Honestly,
but interesting. I mean,
clear.
There is science to back this up. And 100%. Especially in this Reels culture that we have, this swiping, what it does.
And it's killing all our brains, right? Like, it's killing our brains.
Exactly.
I can feel it. So why should my children
what's funny is people don't realize how, in what ways phones are more dangerous. Like, I had someone tell me the other day, don't show phones to your kids because it has UV rays. And I was like, there's no UV in the phone. Phone is damaging, but in other ways. Like,
so, I mean, even if I had to show screen time, like a TV is the best, right? Because the TV doesn't move. The phone just moves everywhere. So, I mean, look, I'm not some great person that I've never shown the phone. Of course, I've shown phones to my kids like 100 times. Sometimes when they're having a tantrum, of course, I've shown them, Achha, let's look at some photos.
Right.
When it's me, if I'm using the phone, I obviously try and show them their own photos. Like, that's just easier for me. Or like we have this app, like this music app. They love the songs from that. So I put on that music quite a bit. But so obviously I have shown phones to my kids. Every parent has done that. But in general, I would say I have fairly strict views about
I think there's something specifically terrible about Reels because it gives you that cheap dopamine hit and the feed refreshes, and that just means you get the novelty that you're seeking in a second.
And I mean, there is so much literature about like how this is affecting mental health for teens and anxiety, and ChatGPT is becoming your new counselor and your new friend, and it's just making us ill-equipped to deal with like social relations. So I just think in general, I feel like I know a lot about technology and I know what's the latest technology. But I guess I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to like my kids, especially using technology. Like, if we have a computer at home for when they become older and they need to do homework, it'll be a desktop. It'll not be a laptop. It'll not be in their room. It will be in the drawing room in a common space. So, like when people saw Adolescence on Netflix, everybody was like, oh my God, like this has opened our eyes. And I'm like, I have always known this. Like, I have read so much about this. So I think that's why I'm very over the top.
Right.
I feel like I'm over the top in everything I do. So this is just like, I'm a type A personality in all aspects of my life. So this is also one of them.
What about your own screen use?
I have no rules. I'm very bad. I don't follow my own advice. I mean, I love watching TV. I don't have Insta. I have Twitter. So now Twitter's also become pretty crap.
Yeah, it's a toxic space.
Yeah, it's pretty toxic.
But your work requires you to be there?
I mean, I joined it. Yes, initially work required me to do it. I posted a lot of things online. It was a great space to connect with technology lawyers and policy thinkers like across the world. And so I actually got a lot of tech news from Twitter. Now I guess it's just habit. And Twitter's also just become like a Reels meme. Like it's become really bad. So I guess in a way, because Twitter's so bad, you kind of can't spend that much time on it as you could on Insta, which is why like I'm so, I just feel it scares me. Like I think I'll become so influenced by all the Reels, and I think it would shatter like self-confidence. And I mean, I think all the influencing and this the right way of parenting and this the right way of running and this, it's fine.
But do you find yourself wasting time on the phone? Like,
I mean, of course, like who doesn't? I mean, like I said, I am it's easy to practice. It's hard to practice what you preach. So, I mean, I have like my phone switches off at like at 10, I've put in those settings on the iPhone so that after 10, like if I have to access any app, I have to keep on saying, ignore the time limit. Like it's meant to act as one kind of fiction. But yeah, I definitely would have like bad phone use.
No, fair enough. Thank you for sharing that. So I had a question about complaining. I don't know whether this comes under your area of expertise as well. But a lot of people who are getting harassed online, does that come under your work purview? Would you be able to advise people on, because people don't know where to go, where to complain, what to do about it?
Yeah. I've done a few cases with respect to that. I also worked with UN Women for a while as a consultant, kind of working on online sexual harassment and online sexual abuse. I mean, it's very rampant.
Yeah. But in India, people are scared of complaining about these things. And first of all, we don't know where to go. Secondly, even if we do, we feel like it's the police that we need to speak with. And then dealing with police comes with its own set of issues. So what advice would you give to someone who's, let's say, getting harassed online?
I mean, really would depend on the facts, but obviously if you can shut it down at your level by blocking, reporting, you write to the grievance officers at Facebook.
That's the first stage.
Yeah, that's the first stage. Doesn't really always work because the grievance officers, like you get an automated response. So it doesn't always work. I mean, apart from that, you really just have two options. Either you go to the police or you go to court. I mean, there's no third body that you can really speak to.
What's cyber cell? Does that help? That's police. Okay. Police section of the police that specifically deals with cyber cases.
Yeah, cyber crimes.
Cyber crimes. Okay. And we left the point there. I wanted to ask you, if we were to, let's say, paint a picture of the extreme end of the misuse of information, if the governments were to misuse that information in some way. So, of course, one is leakage of data and all these scams that happen, and data protection does not exist in India. And it's so, like, I also lived in the UK for 5 years. I did my MBA from Cardiff. And there we have DPA, right? And here you speak with one company for one thing and you're going to get 20 calls for the same thing. And it's just so...
My car insurance was expiring and I got like 10 messages from 10 people. And how do you have my data? It's all because of data brokers.
Can you help us change that?
Well, that's why we were asking for the law for so long. So now we have a law, but it's not been enforced yet because the rules are not in place and there's no data protection board in place. So we really did fight for the law. Then when the law came, we really criticized the law because it really encouraged or permitted surveillance. But, at some point, we need some version of some law at least, because that's better than nothing.
Yeah. And when is the other steps likely to happen?
Well, the rules, the law has been in place since 2023, but the rules haven't come yet. So really, at one point, we keep on hearing that it's going to happen, but I think it's now probably fallen off the priority a little.
Okay, let's talk about something that concerns content creators in particular. Governments and various bodies stepping in to say, you've got to remove this sedition and you've got to remove this content, this piece of content for sedition or other charges that are enforced on you. What is the law governing that and is that...
So you have to challenge that. So a lot of my cases, like in digital rights, are about blocking of access to content or taking down of posts, right? And I do a lot of defamation cases as well. So, this is defamatory, that is defamatory. You have to take recourse to law. So if you get a request, you have to either challenge, you have to comply with the government request. There's no question about it. But then you have to challenge it and then seek a restoration of your account and say that, please restore my account. If it's about taking down a video, then you say, please, put back my video. So you can try it depending on whether the request comes from the government or from the intermediary or the platform. So if YouTube tells you to take something down because it violates YouTube policies, that's different from YouTube asking you to take down something because it's
government told them.
Request. Yes.
Right.
So those are separate and you challenge them separately. But you basically have to, at the end of it, fight it in law. And that's why you now see so many content creators going to court against actions or being taken to court for defamation. Because obviously it's easy to level a defamatory allegation, and the Delhi High Court generally has a jurisprudence of takedown of content. So it's a preferred court as well for many plaintiffs.
Okay. Right. About what are some of the things that worry you about the laws that govern our daily lives? This is like a broader, like very broad question.
Very meta question, I would say. I mean, honestly, it's not the laws, it's the enforcement, I think, that worries me. It's the laws are fine. I mean, there's always going to be better laws or worse laws, but it really is the enforcement. In some cases, the lack of enforcement. In some cases, the asymmetric enforcement, like the targeting of certain communities and, those sorts of things. I think that's, I would say, is what worries me. It's not the laws per se. We don't need more laws. People always say pass more laws, like introduce death penalty. And that's not the answer. The answer really is better enforcement of existing laws and reducing the traumatizing process of going to court, of going to the police. I think that for an average citizen, that's, I think, the traumatic part. It's the interaction with the judicial system or the state.
Where things take forever to resolve.
Yeah.
What's currently keeping you busy? What's the main law or current?
I mean, there's no one big case. I mean, I think what people don't realize is lawyers have like 10 small cases every day. So I would say, not one big matter. I mean, I've been doing a lot of matters for prisoners. So I do a lot of work with convicts in terms of release, etc. So I've filed a bunch of petitions.
I feel like whatever you say, we can just double click on anything and it's so interesting. We can tell us about this one. Like,
I mean, this is...
What's it like?
I mean, I love it. It's basically when you get life imprisonment in India, you are sentenced for life. The rules are that after 14 years, people have heard of 14 years. So after 14 years, you're eligible for remission or release, but it's not guaranteed release. So you have people who are in prison for like 25, 26 years and, have been rejected for release or remission multiple times by the Sentence Review Board. So we've challenged some of those decisions. So we got one guy out, I think after 23 years in jail, on the idea that rehabilitation, if you believe and the criminal justice system believes in rehabilitation and reform, so then you have to act on it. And you have to believe that people, despite having committed the most heinous of crimes, have served their punishment and deserve to come out. So we've done some work on that. I've done some work on disability rights of late as well in terms of, admissions and reservations for disabled students and accessibility issues. But otherwise, really, it's not one big issue. I would say it's a bunch of small issues. Like I said, I do a lot of criminal law. I practice a lot of criminal law as well. So one part of my practice is criminal appeals, bails, under trials.
Tell us a little bit about that. What's it like?
I mean, just, the fact that 2/3 of our prison population from the last time I remember checking the statistic is actually comprised of under trial. So people who have not been formally convicted in a case, but are just under trial. They've just been charged with an offense or accused of committing an offense. And they comprise 2/3 of our prison population.
Wow.
So, pre-trial detention is a big problem. I mean, Umar Khalid is in jail for 5 years, right? And he's not been convicted by any court yet. So that's the issue of under trial prisoners.
And he's not the only one. He's the one in...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There's just so many. Okay. Cool. Let's talk about running.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can feel free to delete all of that. If that's too political for the podcast, I have no problem.
No. This was all interesting. It was so nice to hear. And one just doesn't get time. I should probably reflect on life a little bit more and then, come up with all the things that we don't know about and they impact our lives in so many ways. An average person does not really just, give it a thought. Like
most people who come to court have never gone to court before, right? They're not serial litigants. And like whether it's a partition dispute, I do a lot of partition matters like civil suits, whether it's partition disputes, whether it's normal, a company who suddenly had an issue and has to go to court. And these are not serial litigants or big companies that are used to it. These are people for whom getting a legal notice is scary. And what does that mean? And so, it's not that only criminals need the law, right? Or use the legal system. A lot of people just come into contact with the legal system, without wanting to.
Yeah. Great. So how did your running journey begin? I think it was...
So I started in college. I was in my 4th year and there was a Bangalore midnight half marathon. And, me and my other friend...
What year was this?
2000. So I graduated 2012, 2010.
Okay.
2010. I'd never run a race. And so midnight half was like a very interesting concept. Obviously, Bangalore was safe. So, there were none of those issues. But, this was a time when we really didn't know anything about training. You're running with basketball shorts. There was no Garmin. There was like no pedometer.
But Courtney Dauwalter still runs in basketball shorts. Those massive ones.
I mean, now I would not run in them. I have run races in them. But really, we just didn't know much about training. Much of like, we were living in college. We had no money. So we do a long run and go and have the mess dosa for like breakfast on Sundays. And that was the long run breakfast, right? One dosa. But that was the first time I ran. And I ran it in 2 hours, like 2:00 dot. So I was like, okay, maybe like I have something, like I'm not too bad at this. I had run, I think the max, like I had run in training was 14 kilometers. We weren't even sure because we really had no way of measuring the distance.
There was no Strava back then.
I mean, Strava, there was no Garmin. There was no, like, we didn't even, like at that time, those pedometers were popular, but we didn't have them because they were too expensive for us. So really, it was just, we think this is the airport road. It looks like, sometimes if you go in taxi, you'll say, Bhaiya, kitna, how much distance have we covered? It really was very random. So I ran in fourth year Bangalore. Then I ran Jaipur half the next year. Then when I was in Oxford, I ran the Oxford half once. And so I'd done 3 marathon halves by then. And I got married right after I came back from college. And I joined this running group. And I think that's when it really, changed for me.
What's it called?
Lutyens Road Runners. You can call it however you want. LRR is really what we said. Yes. So it's a great group. Very
Started
diverse.
By who?
Started by a bunch of friends. There were, I think, 3 original founders. Zubin, Harsh, and Ritin. Maybe Gil as well. I'm not sure who were the exact founders. But it started apparently as an email chain amongst friends saying like, let's meet tomorrow for a run. So it really just started with friends running around Lutyens, Delhi. And so, they called themselves the Lutyens Road Runners. And now it's expanded. It's a pretty big group. I mean, I've been on the group since 2014. So it's been going on for much before. We're not on any social media. Nobody knows about us because it's not a social group. Like, it's not a social media group. It's not an influencing sort of group. Like, we don't post anything. We don't have events. We don't have LRR jerseys.
Right.
When we sign up for VDHM and it says, are you part of a running club? We're not. It's not like everybody wears, the same jerseys when they go for races. We once got singlets made, but really it's completely like just a group of friends who run together and have added their friends, and it's sort of become a bigger group. Yeah, I mean, it's a great group. We have a very diverse.
How many people are there in the group now?
I would have to check WhatsApp to see.
But you said it's grown.
Yeah, I mean, there were like 15. I mean, there are probably like 40, 50 members on the WhatsApp group, but 20, 30 participate regularly. Yeah.
Okay, so it's very
it's very small
boutique.
By like, it's very small by running group, 200, 300.
Exactly.
It's because it is literally friends.
Right.
It is not like come just join us. Like, after to the races, we all meet at somebody's house and have like, we'll celebrate like the racing season, so after VDHM or NDM, we'll all meet at some friend's house and just kind of talk about the races. So really it is just actually friends who now come to know each other. And I think it's very supportive. Like, everything I am in terms of running is because of LRR and the people there. I've learned everything.
But how are you guys all so fast? Like,
it's a fast group. That is a fact. It's a really fast group. We have a bunch of sub 3s. We have sub 250s. We have like somebody ran a sub 3 in Boston, which is obviously really impressive. We have like a sub 120 as well, like a half. Yeah. We have really fast.
As you say, birds of the same feather flock together.
I mean, yeah, it's a fast, I would say on average, it's a fast group. But it's also just, it's not that everybody's that fast. Obviously not, right? And so people do their slow runs together. People do their easy runs together, and it's not like everybody runs together also. Some members of the group will run at Amrita Shergill, some will run at Nehru Park, some will run at both. So really, I think it's very flexible. It's not like everybody has to meet on this day. So everybody's doing their own workouts, and then you do them with other members of the group. So you'll post your workout saying, this is what my coach has told me today. This is what I'm doing. If anybody else is running this, we can do the warm-ups together. So it's not like you also run together.
Right.
If you're doing an easy run, then yes, you obviously can run together. So I guess it's a different kind of running group. It's not like your average running group. But I mean, the people are wonderful. I think they really are wonderful. We support each other. Everybody's seen the highest highs and the lowest lows. and I think we learn from each other. Like, you have people with very different life. Like, we have somebody who's run like literally 50 marathons. You have somebody who's, like a security guard whose job is so hard. And, really, he has traveled and, gone to Boston and run in Boston.
Wow.
And, the group really came together to support him going and to like help, with his expenses to some extent. So I think it's a very diverse group. And I think that's what gives it strength. Because, it's important I just think it's good to have diversity in life. I just think we are too surrounded by people who think like us, who talk like us, who look like us. And so I think it really teaches you a lot about mental resilience when you see just how people overcome different challenges. And I think, like I said, you have some people run on Saturdays, some people run on Sundays, some people cycle. So it's a very flexible group. So you can do your own thing. Like, I only go to Delhi twice a week to run. I run in Noida the rest of the days. And so when I go to Delhi, there'll always be somebody. Nehru Park. Sometimes I go to Amrita Shergill, but like mostly like Lodi, but mostly I go to Nehru Park.
Right.
And so, at least you'll meet people for warm-ups. You'll meet people during cool down. So you may do your workout separately, but you still kind of park next to each other and you meet together. So I think that's
I can understand. It's very unconventional, like a very not so typical of.
Because I don't think it's meant to be like a running group. Like I said, like nobody posts. I mean, people post on their personal Instagrams, but like there's no group like, oh, great LRR day today. I think because nobody cares that much about like maintaining the LRR brand, and we kind of like it. We don't want to become very like, it's not meant to be this, let's increase membership. We don't care about members. We don't want to have 200 members because it is really a group about friends. Like,
bonding, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's people you want to go for coffee with after your runs, people that you want to hang out with after a race. So I think that's why it's very different. That's why it's not known at all.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I co-founded a group called the Sun Chasers with a couple of friends of mine. It was all based around friendships only. So we had all just gotten into ultra running and we ran a couple of ultras together, and we were like, the group was initially made for coordination, for getting to the race. And then slowly we added a few more friends who were of the same interest. Then we realized that there's this important thing called crewing in ultras.
Of course.
When you're running for hundreds of miles, right? You do need crew.
Yeah.
So we would be at the stadium or on the trail crewing for people.
Yeah.
So we're building this whole culture around it, and so it was built around great friendships and the culture of ultra running, and it was great to see. Even though none of us were running together, like we would all train at our own places, and the group had members from Bangalore, Bombay, Lucknow and Chandigarh and everywhere. So I can understand you. Yeah, so even if you don't run together, you can bond.
Yeah, and so I think that's what it is. Like, so once we had somebody who finished all the 6 world majors, and somebody who came back from Boston, and they organized this whole sort of lunch to just hear their race stories.
Right.
When a bunch of people went to Valencia and came back, we went out for a meal again to just hear their race stories and how Valencia went. So I think it's sort of that. Everybody's doing their own training, and that's how it's going to be. At the end of the day, everybody has different goals in running, has different motivations at different points of time. Not everybody is motivated all the time, like you can't be. So I think people are training for different things at different points of time. People are, experiencing injuries. People are focused on other things. So I think this just gives you the space, and there's always somebody who's going to be doing something near what you're doing. So I think that it helps that there'll always be 1 or 2 people at least who will at least be meeting you at 6 o'clock at Nehru Park or 6 o'clock at Lodi. And I think that's what helps.
Yeah. Let's talk about your running journey then. So you did those 3 half marathons, and then how did it evolve from there? So you joined this group.
I joined the
Delhi.
group, and I really saw a steady increase. So from my first race was ADHM, was 139, and then like 138, 137, 136, 135, like really slowly, 132.
Well, when was your first podium?
Oh, from probably 139. At that time, 139 would get you a podium.
Right.
Yeah, 139 would have. I mean, I pretty much podiumed.
At all of ADHMs?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would say I've podiumed in probably 90% or maybe 95% of the races. Well, the races, because even when I ran after the kids were born, so both my kids are born in July and Bombay happens in Jan. So for both my kids, it was a 6-month birthday. And that was my first half. And I think maybe I came like 3rd. I don't actually remember because I ran a 142 142 and a 145. 145 for the first kid, and I think 142 after the second kid's birth. I don't remember the exact times, but I do think I podiumed. Or maybe those are the two races I didn't. To be honest, I don't remember.
Right.
But yeah, I would say otherwise, when not postpartum, I probably would have podiumed in every race. Like last year was one of my worst VDHM races ever. Like it was the slowest I've run in 10 years. But I think I came like second.
And NDM, how was last NDM for you?
So last NDM was fine. It was I'm so bad with my times, 3:18, 3:19. The NDM before that was great because that's when I PR'd and I ran a 3:14.
3:14?
Yes. Then I think I came like probably third overall also maybe, or second overall, maybe third overall. I don't remember. As you can see, I'm very bad with like remembering these things and remembering.
Yeah, when you've done so many and won so many. So
I mean,
it's hard to remember.
It's not that important, I guess, right now for me. I'm much more focused on, I guess, improving my time. Like it's the same reason I don't have this deep desire to run Boston right now.
Yeah, so I want to know, when you started running more with the group and maybe till today, what is it about running that keeps you hooked to this sport?
Everything.
What do you like about
running is like my therapy. Yeah. I work very hard, I parent, and then I run. Like running is everything to me. And all runners and definitely all listeners of this podcast will be type A personalities and will be crazy because you have to kind of be crazy to run in this weather. But running has just given me so much joy. I miscarried and running is what helped me go through that. Through everything, like I really feel running has just been there. Like whether it's the solitude, whether it's the exercise, the feeling of sweating, like I love that, right? I've always been an active person. So I think just the feeling that you've done a workout, like nobody, and I tell people, you think, I love getting up every day at 5. Of course I don't. Nobody does. Nobody gets up and is like, yeah, let's go for a run. You're like, oh shit, like I have to wake up. But it's when you finish the run that you do feel a sense of achievement. And the endorphins. I mean, it's scientific, right? Like physical exercise is good for the brain. It's good for the body. It keeps me awake. If I don't run, I kind of feel a bit lazy and like a sloth. I mean, so for me, really running is like exercise is everything. And I think running, I found like I really love. It's meditative.
I want to get to know about your training also. But before we do that, tell me about the mental toughness side of it. So what do you do in the moments that you feel like giving up? And that's pretty much in this weather, pretty much every workout, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, look, that's what I think about running. Like it's the sports is the biggest teacher in life, right? You learn failure. What better place to learn failure than sport? Because you will fail. You cannot succeed all the time. Like there was a time when I was literally every race, I was PRing, right? I was just becoming faster. And then you hit a plateau, right? You hit your you just plateau. You're like, okay, then I got stuck at 132, 131. And like I hit 129 once and I haven't been able to run 129 again. I ran like maybe 4 years ago. I ran a 129 or 5 years ago. And I kind of haven't run 129 again. And then, I focused on full marathons for a bit. So, I'm now trying to improve the 3:14. And it doesn't always work, right? Like I ran a 3:14 and then next year I ran a 3:18. And my last year just generally was pretty bad in terms of training. Like I wasn't, like my VDHM went very badly. And I just, I was overtrained a bit. I kind of wasn't getting it. Like sometimes it just doesn't work. You're doing everything. You're putting in the work, but you're not getting the outcome. And so really to me, genuinely, what better coach in life than sports or running? Because you will fail. You will put in everything, but the marathon owes you nothing. And I think just realizing that because I have put in the effort, I deserve to run, the marathon really owes you nothing. And I think to actually come to terms with it and say, okay, I've put in all this work. I will not benefit this year, but it will help me in the next year. It is going to help me because it's building a training block. And I think when you failed a lot, and I really have failed quite a bit last year, and even before the 3:14, like I didn't have a great VDHM the year, that in the run up, and I wasn't sure. And then things started to, click. And I had no intention of running a 3:14. If you had told me, Vrinda, try for sub 3:15, I would not have run the 3:15. I was running for the first time after 5 years, like a full, because I'd had 2 kids in between. So I kind of hadn't run a full in 5 years. So I also just didn't know what to expect. I just said, okay, let me try and PB. I'd run a 3:21 in Bombay. So I said, I'd like to run a 3:17, 18. I've been training at that level, but I have no idea how my body will react. And I negative split, right? I will never run I may run faster, but I will never run a better race.
Better paced run.
I mean, if you see my stats from that run, oh my God, like I was literally between 4:32 and 4:39.
Can we see it on Strava?
Race. Yeah, I should be able to find it. Nakul had actually put a really nice, Nakul always praises everybody. He's really sweet that way. But I remember he put it on his group and said, this is a really well-paced run. Because it really was. I mean, I will never run a race that well. And I negative split by, I think, 1 minute. Wait, marathon. 3:20. 3:14. Yeah, see, view marathon analysis. Hold on. Yes, marathon PR alert, 3:14:43. So see, these are my splits. Or I can read them out.
You started 4:35, 4:39.
4:39 is the slowest I went.
And yeah, pretty much around 4:35, 4:36.
Yeah, I just ended fast.
Wow.
I think my last kilometer was pretty fast.
4:21.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Like, I will never run a better race than that.
Yeah.
Like, in my life.
And you felt strong throughout? This was last NDM.
So 2023.
Okay, last year.
Yeah,
okay.
Last year was 3:19. This was 2023. Yeah, and this was my first run. And honestly, my only thing was, let's run under 4:39. That's all I wanted. I said, if I'm under 4:39, I think it will be a 3:18, 3:17.
Right.
And then I'll see where it goes. So I did not try for the 3:14. And I think because last year I kind of was trying for that, I psyched myself out. I just, I said, oh, this is marathon pace and I'm not running at marathon pace. And
yeah,
I think, sometimes I think the best results are achieved when you don't expect them. When you actually run freely, not burdened by your own expectations, forget anybody else's expectations.
Yeah.
And I think when I ran this race, I was not burdened by anybody's expectation. I was not burdened by my own expectations. But I think the next year, I kind of felt the burden. And I think it's good. I mean, I really think it is a teaching journey. And, I'm really hoping that this year I've made changes to my training and that should, hopefully, that should
translate into.
I mean, regardless of that, I'm having fun in training. Like, I'm really enjoying my training. I'm really enjoying my workouts. I'm trying something new, more strength, less just volume, less pure volume, like maybe more smarter running.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's see how it goes. But I'm enjoying it. Yeah.
Cool.
In this humidity.
Yeah.
Having salt caps after one salt.
No, but you said a really important thing about trusting the process, I believe, because even if the results are not showing up, the work that you put in is actually helping you. It may not translate into visible results immediately. It's definitely doing its job.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the hard thing, right?
And watch also irritates you sometimes when it's not showing it's showing unproductive and maybe.
God. Yeah. Always unproductive. Garmin just believes I'm perennially unproductive. Or like my race time, my race predictor time would never have said a 3:14. Because it doesn't, I don't go by that.
Yeah.
Like that, actually the watch doesn't affect me at all. Of all the things, like what Garmin tells me means nothing to me.
Yeah. Before we talk about your training, tell us about how do you deal with failure? So when you were aiming for something and it didn't happen, how long do you let that affect you and how do you deal with it? You've not had any DNFs, I'm assuming, and in ultras you have them often,
right.
and they can destroy your mental health. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, I've run 2 Bombays, 2 NDMs. So I've run 4 marathons. Honestly, 3 of them went really well. The first one I ran my first Bombay, and it's hard and everything. I think I ran a 3:35. And that's when I realized, I probably qualify for Boston. Like, I had not even thought of Boston till that point. Then I ran a 3:21, and that was also a negative split. And the first one was also a negative split because I was like, I have no idea what to run. I'll just run. And so, I just kind of had this great experience. And then I ran NDM, and that was great. And then last day was like, this is why marathons are hard. And yeah, I think last year VDHM was the hardest probably that I've ever, I really just could not understand what had happened. It's the first time that I really wanted to stop. And I just said, I'm running 5 pace. Like, what is happening to my body? Why am I not generating energy? And I could not understand what had happened to me. Like, my body had just shut down. And obviously I cried. Like, I came back and I cried and I let it all out. And I would say I was really upset for that day. By the second day I became better. And I think, I kind of got over it. I mean, also when you have 2 young kids, the day of VDHM, was a pretty shitty race. But then I had to take the kids out for some play date. They don't care. And my daughter wrote me the sweetest letter before NDM saying, don't worry, mama, you still came second. So I think that helps, right? You realize that running is everything, but it's not everything.
Right.
It's the results don't define you. And, I sound like I'm very knowledgeable, but really I'm not. And I don't always practice what I preach. And it's very easy to come on a podcast and say these things. And people think, oh my God, they have it all sorted out. And nobody does. And I don't. I just think it's, what's right. You try and aspire to do what's right, but you don't always achieve that. And I think, I would say I'm still learning. I still struggle with failure sometimes. And I think that's where I'm lucky. Like, I will call up a bunch of running friends and just vent to them and then get advice from them. And, a lot of people called me after VDHM and said, it's okay. It's over. Just like move on. And I think that's what is great about having a running community that's not a social, like, influencer, like social media kind of, because people just call you and say, are you okay? And you will be. You will run better next time. And just help you analyze your run and what are the changes you need to make in your training. Get some blood tests done. So I had friends throughout last year who really advised me on this. And I think especially as a girl, as a woman, it's really important because women's hormones are different, right? That's what my coach always keeps on saying. She's always like, female athletes are different.
It's a minefield.
Yeah. So I think just also understanding that is really important.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's been great.
And I'm just delaying talking about your training, but tell me about the challenges of being a female athlete.
I mean, challenges, I think it's more just understanding the body and understanding. So I think when you're senior, like menopause or perimenopause does affect a lot of women, right? Yeah. I've not experienced that yet. For context, for your viewers, I'm 36. I will turn 36 this year. So I'm still fairly on the younger side, I would say, in terms of perimenopause or anything like that. Touch wood, so far also the hormonal cycle doesn't affect me. Like for a lot of people it does. But my coach, she's always very particular about like track your cycles. No, so that tomorrow if you have to do an analysis of your workouts, we know. So data in that sense will be really helpful. I think it's more understanding the needs of a female athlete are different. So iron deficiency was like a big thing for me. When I did a blood test, I was in the normal parameters. But it was low for a female athlete. Like I said, I've had 2 kids, so, breastfeeding and calcium and all of that. So also just being very mindful of that in terms of, so I think understanding hormones, understanding sleep, understanding how these things affect you as a female athlete, and they can be different. Like, I remember hearing some podcast which said that women need gels more than men do or something. Like fasted running is not that great for women, like just in terms of how their body works. And so you will need more carbs if you can. Like you don't run fasted for women. So I think just implementing some of these changes and understanding that like nutrition really is very, very important. Nutrition and hydration. So I would say just understanding how running, what the needs of the female body are. Obviously it was challenging in terms of pregnancy and postpartum and getting back to running. Obviously that's a uniquely female challenge. Safety is a bit of an issue. I would say I've been pretty lucky. I think Delhi, in that sense, actually the running centers like Nehru Park or Lodi, they're very safe. I feel safe.
I joined a women's only call that All In Running hosts. Yes. I think once a month or something. And there you mentioned about one challenge being that these bikers sometimes would just stick their hand out.
Yes. So that actually happened in Bangalore, right? Like I think it's just as women, you're attuned to like if a bike is going very near you, you just want to be, your instinct is just to move a bit on the side. You still would feel conscious wearing a sports bra and running on the streets in Delhi. Like you just would be a little bit, you do it abroad without thinking because nobody's going to stare at you. But you would just feel that little bit of consciousness. It's not something I've really done, like remove my shirt and run in Delhi. I think once when it was so hot and it was so humid and I was dying. But really, I would not run without a shirt. You just feel conscious. So I think those are some of the challenges.
Okay. I think जो fast runners होते हैं उनसे सब कुछ ही पूछ लेना चाहिए उनकी training के बारे में.
Really nothing. There's
but how did you become better, faster? When did you start following structured training? And then talk us through your journey of becoming better every year. What are sort of the main principles that you followed that got you there?
I think honestly it's structure. I think structure is the answer to everything. There's no one workout that's the best and there's no like, do these 2 workouts and that's it. You're going to be great. I think honestly having a coach helps. I'm not smart enough to read up everything, understand and apply it to myself. I cannot do that.
Even if you read up everything and it's just hard to, which is why coaches also have coaches.
Yes.
It's 100%. Just hard to,
100%. And also just, I want to outsource that part of my life.
Yeah.
Like I cannot think.
Yeah.
I have enough thinking to do. I want somebody to tell me this is the workout.
And you're also like so attached, like so close to yourself, which is why also consultants help, like because they can have an outsider's view.
Of course.
And you will be just too emotional about things. And
and I've learned a lot, like in this cycle, I've really been trying to really run easy. Like my easy runs run easy, right? We all know that everybody 10 years ago was running every run fast. And, what will people say on Strava? You can't run a 6:30 pace. Oh my God. Today, I am okay to run like a slow run. And if that's 6:10 for like 10 kilometers, and if it's a recovery run, that's fine. Like I actually don't care. And I don't care what people on Strava will say. But I think getting to that point took some time, right? Like, oh, I can't have a run that's so slow. Like, how can I be running? But really, the literature is so clear now. Fast runs, hard days should be hard, easy days should be easy. I think strength training, I really seriously only started strengthening a couple of years ago. Before that, not really. I think strength training is game-changing. I think nutrition and hydration is game-changing.
Tell us about all of these that you've learned over the last couple of years. Strength training, what does your strength routine look like?
So now I'm trying to do it twice a week. Go to the gym twice a week, do a 40 to 60-minute session. My coach.
Not body weight anymore? Or did you start with body weight ever?
I mean, probably body weight at some point I was doing in the beginning. I mean, there's still some body weight exercises I could do, like mobility work. That would be body weight, obviously.
No, but strength work. But so strength and mobility, in my head, they're separate
things.
Yeah,
they are. They're completely separate. I mean, now I would do strength work with weights only. I would not be doing... Maybe I do... I mean, there'll be some exercises that will probably be body weight, but really it is primarily...
lifting.
Weights. Yeah. Yeah, like dumbbell squats, deadlifts, kettlebell swings. I mean, just any sort of leg press.
Right.
Depends on where your weaknesses are.
So you do 2 sessions of full body?
Yes. Yes.
2 sessions a week?
2 sessions a week. And, I have programmed, these are the exercises I'm supposed to do. My coach just tells me follow that. So I'll just follow that kind of blindly. If my physio has told me to follow some exercises, I'll do those as well in addition.
How many days a week do you run?
So right now I'm only running 4 days a week. Well, now 5 because I've added a recovery run of 5K. During peak marathon training, I almost never went beyond 5 days. Once when I had to hit 100K that week, I did 6 days. But otherwise, even during peak marathon training, I usually run only 5 days. So I'll do 5 days. One day will be strength. And like Mondays is just yoga, like no exercise, only yoga. So Sunday is the long run, Monday is the rest.
Active rest.
Yeah, active. But I mean, the yoga really helps me, like with the stretching. My yoga sir's been coming home for like 10 years. He knows, he just knows what exercises I need. Wednesdays will be the workout days. I find for my body, I used to first do Tuesday, Thursday. I can't do 3 speed sessions in a week. I will get injured. So I do like Wednesday is the big speed session. And then Sunday will be the second speed session.
When's the long run?
With the long run. As in within the long run, you'll try and do some speed work, at least every alternate week.
Like strides and...
No, like a work, like a mini. Like for marathon training, you'll do like 4K into 2 within the long run.
Okay.
Or 1.2 or 1.5K into 5 sets within the long run. So like within the long run, putting in some marathon pace work. So that then becomes a workout in and of itself. But otherwise also I find like doing more than 2 workouts. So if it's a long run, you try and put in some speed there as well. Otherwise and it's not every Sunday is not a speed work. Like within the long run, it's every alternate. So that,
Okay.
1 week will just be easy, consistent, steady running. And then 1 week will be some speed work. And then Wednesdays, that's the main kind of speed session. Sometimes on Fridays, you'll do some fartleks, depends. Or you do strides some other days, like you'll do strides on one day, just to increase. I've really been doing a lot more strides in the last 2-3 years, I think. That's something I almost never did before 3 years ago. I would probably never do.
So your long runs are not LSDs, the long, slow distance runs?
I mean, every alternate
because
week,
you're putting in speed work.
Yeah, well, like, alternate weeks are steady. I would not say they're not slow. They're like steady. I don't think they're long, slow. Like they would be steady runs, like at least 15-20 kilometers, and that would be steady pace.
Right.
But not slow.
Okay. What does your marathon training weekly mileage look like and your
Well, right now it's
maintenance?
Just 65-70K. It will go up.
What's your next race that's coming up?
I mean, at VDHM, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm hoping to do Valencia as the marathon. Like that's the big goal. VDHM is just,
Okay.
route on the goal. Valencia probably will be the big marathon if hopefully I can.
When is it?
December.
Okay.
So once I start really upping mileage, it'll go up to 80 as the base. And then
So your maintenance is 60, 65?
65, 70. So last year it used to actually be higher. This year I'm cycling once a week. So last year my maintenance used to be 75, 80. Like I could do 80K just like every week without a problem. This year we're trying something. That's what I'm saying. This year I'm trying something different, like doing one cycling session. And so reducing the mileage by 10 kilometers, but adding a 1 hour cycling session to see if
Cross-training.
Yeah. I mean, look, the literature is also, cross-training does help. It's low impact. It reduces injury risk and it is good. I mean, it gives you aerobic benefits. So I'm trying to see how that will play out. So right now so Mondays is rest day, Tuesdays is strides, Wednesdays workout, Thursdays like a 5K recovery and strength. Friday will be a slow, like a easy run. Saturday will be a cycling and strength session. So you do a 1 hour cycling and a 1 hour strength session, and then Sunday is the long run. So it's the cycling that I've added. Whereas otherwise, I would probably be doing, like during marathon training, maybe I'll remove the cycling and then that's how I'll increase the mileage. So that's something I still have to figure out. But right now I'm at 70K, 67, 70K. The max I've gone right now in this so far in the training cycle is only 75.
Okay.
So, but that's where I'd like to keep it. Like I was at 60 in off season. My base will probably almost always be between 55 and 60, like in any week.
Right.
I've increased that to 70. It's probably going to go up. Like I'm probably sure this week I'll end up running 75. So like I've done 2 days of running and I've run 30 so far. So yeah, my mileage varies. And then obviously during marathon season, it'll increase to 80, 85, 90, 95. And hopefully 1 or 2 weeks at 100.
At 100.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah, I think at performance level, you do need heavy mileage as well.
I mean, there's no substitute for mileage, right?
Yeah.
So the cycling is meant to supplement that and to maybe not focus just, if it's 10K easy run versus 1 hour cycling, I'm trying to see if the cycling can kind of, if I can make do with that.
Right.
So, this is an experiment this time. So I have to see how it plays out. I've never really cycled this late in the season. I usually only used to cycle in like May, June, and that's kind of it. Then I used to cycle off and on. But this time I've been very consistent with cycling once a week.
How many races do you do in a year?
Oh,
how do you plan your race?
Honestly, VDHM, Bombay, NDM every year. Last 2 years there's been Navy, and first it was the Army run and then there was the Navy, which happens just before NDM. So it's the perfect pre-NDM training run. So these are like the standard calendar. Like I will always do them. I love Bombay. Like I just think it's so well organized. I love the vibe.
You do TMM every year?
So TMM I've actually pretty much done every year except the years I was pregnant. VDHM or Airtel, because of the timings in terms of my pregnancies, I ended up missing it both the year I was pregnant and then it was too soon postpartum. So my kids were born in July, so October I couldn't run. That's why TMM I've actually run more because it was 6 months from the kids' birthdays. So I could run TMM. So yeah, I go to Bombay every year. I just love the atmosphere. And I really enjoy the runs. Yeah. These 4, I've done Toughman a couple of times. Nothing else consistent.
Okay.
This year, I'm hoping to do Valencia. I haven't really run internationally so far. I ran in Oxford when I was in Oxford, but I haven't really traveled for a race.
Right.
So this would be the first time if it happens. Let's see. I don't know. Till I go there, I don't know if it's going to happen. But I would like to do... The problem is in India, there just aren't that many marathons. I'd like to do 2 marathons a year.
Yeah. But you have 2 very, very close to each other. Like there's TMM and NDM.
Yeah, that's why I can't do TMM and NDM together. They're too near each other. Like you can't get your best in both. So ideally, you want to do one, like an NDM and then a Valencia.
There's Hyderabad marathon, but then that has flyovers and whatnot.
That's hard. And honestly, I can't, like, for me, training in the summer and running a marathon is also hard because June I don't train at all. Like, I really take off because it's court holidays. So I'm like, I can't do any serious running in June.
Right.
And so running a marathon in October means you really have to use June as a training block, right? You can't just kind of take off. And June, I really run only maintenance. Like if I'm not in Delhi, because we get a whole month off. So kind of that's my time off.
Have you considered going longer?
At some point, maybe a try, because I also swim and I can swim a 1K, like even right now I'm just in general fitness wise. Maybe an ultra for when I'm older, but honestly, it's a huge time commitment and I don't have the time. I really struggle already with time, with work, because work is very stressful. Like my work is really, really stressful. It's also not just like long hours, it's physically stressful, it's mentally stressful. Like you're just always on.
Yeah.
And I don't think I have the space in my life for ultra right now.
So now that you touched upon how stressful and long hours you work, also tell us a little bit about time management. How do you manage time? Do you have strict rules around what you allow, what you don't allow into your life?
I don't drink. I've never really liked alcohol, so that helps. I think I don't feel I'm giving up.
Right.
I have a great set of friends, and nobody really parties. We play board games, like we're very boring and geeky. So we're not like, oh, let's go out clubbing. Like I've never been that kind of person. I really was a nerd. Like I really was quite boring. So I think those are not my interests. We meet friends, so that's fine. You know, that's much more chill, I think. And I don't want to give up on that. It does compromise on sleep, but it's important. Like I think it's important from a social perspective. It's important, you know, to spend time with my husband and like our friends, like, and not just make running my everything.
Yeah.
So from a family time perspective, it's important as well. Yeah, but I don't know. I feel, I don't know. I guess I don't really feel I've given up on a lot. But yeah, maybe I don't do random parties. But I don't feel that's missing out on me because I really, anyway, wasn't like that. I don't enjoy that beyond a point.
But how do you train through like really busy times? How do you train through that period where you're finishing work late and then you have a run in the morning?
I mean, I can survive on low sleep. It's not good for me.
Yeah.
But like for the longest.
What does low sleep look like?
Like 5.5 hours.
Okay.
I can like easily get up and run after 5.5. And I can be fresh. Like I can sleep. I mean, today I woke up at 4:55, right? Because I had my workout in Delhi. And like we're at 10 o'clock now at night. So, yeah. I mean, it's a long day. But you might not make out that I've been up like since 5 in the morning.
I woke up at 3:55 today. I ran 24 kilometers today before work.
So exactly.
Yeah,
so,
similar.
Yeah, so you understand.
Yeah, but I have had like completely washed out periods as well where I just don't run at all. So I've had that. But for somebody to be able
I've
to
not had that.
Yeah.
I would not say I've really, since I've started running, I don't think I've really stopped running. I mean, I've pretty much run through. I mean, yeah. I think like I'm not good on following on Strava, but I think like my Strava, I had like a Strava streak also of like some 100 weeks or something. I mean, and I'm sure it's longer. It's just I may not have loaded it
right.
But at least running. Yeah, I mean, I would not say I've really stopped running. I mean, bar some injury or something, but not really. So I don't know. I just think a kind of when you have lesser time, you fill in space in that time, right? Like I still watch a lot of TV. Now we're trying to like not watch as much TV during weekdays because then I end up sleeping late. So I try and sleep by 11 o'clock, 10:30, 11 if I can. It doesn't always happen. But yeah, I don't know. I don't feel I'm giving up much. My friends think I'm crazy. Like they're like, why do you like running so much? So, I mean, it's interesting when you meet non-runners, obviously. You realize that what we are doing is crazy to the outside world. And it is. I mean, I think...
It is.
And it is... I would also say it is probably, for me, it's a slightly unhealthy obsession. I mean, I think I'm a little bit obsessed with it.
Yeah.
In a way that's not entirely healthy because you do make up you get so affected by one bad workout and at the end of the day, you're all doing it for pleasure. But it's given you a lot of heartbreak.
Yeah. But would you also not say that marathon running isn't for fitness? Like, running a marathon...
it's for more. I mean, I don't think you're just going to run a marathon because you want to be fit. It's a lot of work to put in to be fit.
Exactly.
No, I just think it's the reason people are doing more ultras. People are doing, there's so much...
you don't climb Everest to just be fit.
There's so much writing coming out in today's day and age. People want to be disconnected and experience the inner self and like, be disconnected from technology and sort of all of that. So I guess that's the answer.
Yeah. I'll let you go after this question. What are some of the peripheral things that you do around running that enable your running and your mental peace and everything? So do you do things for recovery like massages?
Oh, I mean, I got a myofascial release today. If that helps, to just like remove all the knots in the body from needling. Yeah, I try and get a massage if I can. I go to the local beauty parlor, nothing fancy. I'll just go like, my legs are really hurting. Please give me a massage. I have a Normatec, which I guess is active recovery or not active, whatever, passive recovery, which you can wear those space boot looking things. Yoga really does help me in terms of stretching.
And sleep, but you sort of
I'm really
compromise.
trying to improve sleep. Right. I really am trying to improve sleep. And honestly, it's like you hear so many podcasts and they'll all say the same thing, that you can try and optimize. These are all 1% optimizing. Good food, good hydration, good sleep. You have that, you're recovered. This is all what we are doing is because the things that we need to do, we don't do.
Yeah.
So we're trying to optimize that 1% and let me get this and let me get that. And honestly, if you sleep well and you eat well, you're fine. The problem is most of us don't do that.
Correct. I said I'll let you go, but I lied because I just realized we haven't touched upon hydration and nutrition. Do you want to share some broad principles of things that you've messed up on before?
So I have that constraint.
Okay.
But I do eat egg. So I try and get my protein through protein shakes and eggs because I can't have chicken or fish or anything. I take, hydration I've really started this year. I've tried before my run to take ORS or like some, reload.
Before your run?
Before my run. Because I get very dehydrated. Like I can drink crazy amounts of water, like more than an average person. Like I can drink 7 liters of water in a day without any problem. And I sweat more than the average person. Like even in my running group, I sweat like crazy. So I really need to be careful because I lose, if I don't have salt caps, like I will start getting woozy. So I think really focusing on having more gels. I didn't have gels during training runs, honestly, not during workouts, but now I do.
What does your marathon gel intake look like?
6 gels or 7 gels, like one at the beginning and then one every half an hour. So between 6 and 7 gels is what. Like,
and salt caps and stuff?
Honestly, I should take more. It's just a question of where to put them. I took one last time. I took 1 or 2 during TMM because TMM is particularly hot. So you really do need the salt caps. I think I should take more. It's really, I've not been able to figure out a good way to store my salt caps.
Mm-hmm. You don't run with the hydration vest?
No, I can't. I can't run with the hydration vest. So...
But what do you do with the hydration then? Do you carry a bottle or especially in this weather?
Oh, right now? That's why I run in Nehru Park, put the bottles in the cars and just keep on running the loops around Nehru so that you carry 200 ml bottles.
Right.
And just carry them with you, put them in the car, like put them on top of the car. Otherwise, there's no other way to do it. Otherwise, you'll be stopping like every 2 seconds. And it does mean we do sometimes stop, obviously, like to quickly drink water. But I'm quite mindful if I'm doing a proper workout of not stopping during the workout part of the workout. Then I'm fairly careful of just taking the water on the go. So just picking it up from the car, dropping that, picking up another bottle.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
I think I really enjoyed the conversation.
We've done a good...
Thank you for making time, Vrinda. It's a lovely conversation.
Great conversation.
Yeah. Would love to run with you at some point.
Yes.
Perhaps when I can get to your pace.
Oh, no, not at all, please.
Or maybe I can catch you on your easy day and my tempo day or something like that.
Nothing like that. There's nothing like that.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot for making time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Cheers.